Just around the corner from here, in 1857, Britain's biggest ever art exhibition was put on show. Manchester Cricket Club vast halls of iron and glass were erected to hold more than 16,000 works of art. Very many of them were originally crafted or painted or sculpted in Europe and further afield. But the vast majority were lent by their now British owners and collectors, from queens and dukes to the ordinary Mr. Neville of Essex, who lent his collection of silver rings. It's true there was a certain sniffiness on the part of a few of the metropolitan elite who wondered if all this really belonged in Manchester and shouldn't they be sticking to their cotton spinning. But it was hard to be sniffy in the face of such an array of international art. And the treasures on display were just the tip of the iceberg. By the mid-19th century, you didn't have to go to India, Egypt, or Italy to experience the art of the world. You could see it here in Britain. Brought by adventurers and collectors, and let's be honest, a few thieves, it's had an enormous influence on British culture. Changed our landscape. It's shaken up our artistic traditions. It has even helped shape our idea of what civilization is. We now take it for granted that we can see the civilizations of the world here. But that raises all kinds of questions. How did it all get here? Was it fair means or foul? Why was it brought here? Were we civilizing others or civilizing ourselves? And just as important, what does it tell us about who we are? Founded in the 6th century by St. Augustine, sent by the Pope to bring Christianity north to the Germanic Anglo-Saxons, and later rebuilt by the invading Normans, Canterbury Cathedral is a grand emblem of this island's long and complicated relationship with the foreign from the Romans on. And it's also where you can find a surprising piece of evidence of our modern fascination with bringing the art and artifacts of the outside world back home. This is one of the few cabinets of curiosities to survive from the 17th century, assembled by an ever so curious clergyman, Dr. John Bargrave. I've never actually got inside a real 17th century cabinet of curiosities before. All these drawers saying, "Open me." Some rosary beads. Up here is, well, it's an animal of some sort. Underneath is a miniature picture of Dr. Bargrave himself. Between 1645 and 1662, Bargrave went several times to Europe, in particular to France and Italy, recording his journeys, drawing his discoveries, and bringing whatever caught his eye back home. This ranged from exotic curios given to him as gifts from far-off lands, to bizarre objects that had piqued his curiosity far closer to home. And this one, a strange object, which looks a bit like a brown finger. Can't quite be certain. Happily, Dr. Bargrave left a catalogue of his collection. And this, indeed, is a mummified finger which he picked up in Toulouse. He was offered, apparently, a mummified baby, but he decided the mummified baby would be a bit too big. So he took the finger as being more portable instead. And behind it, as if that's not enough, there's something which I believe is a hippopotamus's tooth. Bargrave was also quite keen on hacking off little bits from ancient monuments and bringing them back home. This is a bit he's got from one of the obelisks in Rome, and he's had it all polished up and made into the shape of a heart. But others he's just left as they were, wrapped them up in paper. Here is a tiny little bit of the Colosseum, and this one, he names them here. This is a piece of the ruins of the triumphal arch of Septimius Severus in Rome. And there's a whole box full of things he's picked off other monuments. We'd call this vandalism now, I think, and it's definitely not allowed. Poking around Dr. Bargrave's drawers gives us a wonderful glimpse into the 17th century mind, informed as much by religious faith as scientific inquiry. And if they already show the beginnings of an interest skewed towards Italy and Rome, there is no hierarchy here in the display of the civilizations of the world. And that was precisely the point. What Bargrave is doing in assembling this here, in bringing it home, is representing in miniature the wonders of God's world. The ordinary, the extraordinary, the man-made, the natural, the fakes and the forgeries. And at the same time, with all these objects and his own personal stories, he's asking an even bigger question, which is, where do I fit into all this? Only a few decades later, this was one answer to that question. This is Castle Howard in Yorkshire, home from the early 18th century to the very well-heeled Earls of Carlisle. Not so much a house as a vast cabinet of curiosities, now with a very one-track mind. This was no longer a representation of the wonder and variety of God's world, but of the imperial landscape of Rome. In the place of fragments chipped off ruins, into the damp fields of Yorkshire came full-scale recreations of Roman monuments, mausoleums and temples, obelisks, even pyramids, copied not from Egypt, but from Roman tombs. At its centre was the Great House, whose corridors were stuffed with a huge collection of Roman statues or marbles that the Earls of Carlisle shipped back to Britain at vast expense from their Italian grand tours. Unknown woman. Cato the Elder. However they might look now, at the time, places like this were mind-blowingly radical and had been put together with a singular vision that hadn't been seen since the Romans were actually here. This entire house has been designed to walk you through the landscape of ancient Rome. Not just on the outside, but on the inside too, which is loaded with busts of emperors, statues of gods and heroes and ancestors, and any number of Roman worthies, and sometimes not so worthies. It's an extraordinary collection of art, acquired with cash and clout on a wholly new scale. But it's also been co-opted to make a very particular point about Britain's place in history. You can see it as a massive statement of intent. It's Britain, not the tawdry, down-at-heel, slightly loose modern Italians. It's Britain that's going to be the rightful inheritor and the true guardian of the traditions of ancient Rome. Its power, its empire, its virtue, its culture, and the whole of Roman civilization. And Castle Howard wasn't alone. Aristocrats all over the country succumbed to what was called marble mania, scrambling to co-opt the legacy of Rome into the service of their own politics and power. It was now the classical world, or at least their reconstruction of it, that was seen to embody the highest state of civilization. Its art was an ideal of beauty that would determine the British view of other civilizations for centuries to come. There's huge self-confidence on display here, but my feeling is that that's only one side of the story. Power plays like this are often a bit smoke and mirrors, and this ostentatious extravaganza is actually a bit more improvised, a bit messier, insecure even, than it tries to make you think. There are some stunning pieces here. There's also plenty of the rough and ready. There's heads on the wrong bodies. There's implausible restorations, plaster casts and fragments. In fact, it's not quite so far as it might look from the cabinet of Dr. Bargrave. It's a projection of power, all right, and it's a fantastic stage set. But look closer, like so many grand displays, it's built on a ragbag of bits and pieces. This would be the story of how Britain built its collections right up to the 20th century. Not through state sponsorship like in France, but through the opportunism and ready cash of individuals, even at the most ruthless height of empire. Nowhere is this clearer than at Powys Castle, home to a unique collection of Indian treasures brought back, some would say stolen, at the end of the 18th century by a governor of the East India Company, Sir Edward Clive, son of Robert, the notorious Clive of India. Containing around 300 objects, from exquisitely carved ivory chess pieces and playing cards, to ceremonial armour and caches of weapons. Much of it came here after a single event: the defeat of Tipu Sultan, the last ruler to hold out against British dominance in southern India. After the interception of a letter to the Sultan from Napoleon in 1799, the East India Company stormed his city and ransacked his palace. The Clive family got their hand on quite a bit of the loot of Tipu, and these are just three pieces. The most notorious is this extraordinary tiger head here, and tiger was Tipu Sultan's personal symbol, and got set in it rubies and diamonds and emeralds. This was one of the attachments to the grand throne of Tipu Sultan, which, when the British discovered it, they dismembered it and stripped it. They took off all the gold, they removed all the decorative bits, and this is just one that survived. But for me, the most poignant bit are these slippers of Tipu Sultan. The fact is that the looting of Tipu Sultan went right down to his dress, and even worse, there's a really horrible story about a British soldier coming along with a penknife just after Tipu Sultan had died and looting his moustache. It's no coincidence that the very word loot, from the Hindustani slang for to plunder, was first used in English at this time. And in fact, there was so much Tipu loot coming to Britain that the East India Company set up their own museum for people to come and see it. One piece, now in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, was the star attraction. This is a wonderfully sophisticated curiosity. It's not just a wooden tiger mauling a wooden European soldier. If you turn that handle, the tiger starts to roar and the soldier raises his hand and starts to scream. And what's more, if you take the top of the tiger off, you'll find inside a little portable organ. It's as if this is a combination of musical instrument, executive toy, and high-tech 18th century gadget. But that wasn't the only reason why people came to see this in their thousands. The fact that it had been part of the interior decoration of Tipu's palace meant that for all its sophistication, it was still proof of Tipu Sultan's savagery. That played into a wider narrative, because it was at this period that the word civilization first entered the English language, and the ancient contrast between civilization and barbarity was reinvented and redeployed to describe modern differences between us and them on the outside. And that, in turn, served to justify British imperial takeover, plunder, or, as some people chose to put it, the civilizing mission. Tipu's story tells us that from the beginning, civilization was a loaded word, coined with one eye on the Latin word for citizen, civis or civis, to express a particularly Western version of the world order. But also at the V&A is another work of art, this time from Japan, which flips that story and reminds us that one person's civilization can be another's barbarity. It's an image of an encounter between a Western European and a Japanese prostitute. Now, the precise mechanics of what's going on is a bit difficult to work out, but basically they're at it by an open window, and it looks as if it must be rather wintry weather because they're very wrapped up in all these clothes. But what's striking for me is how here it's the Western European who is shown as the monstrous barbarian. He's got shaggy, unkempt hair and beard, starey eyes. The hand here, his hand with his very long nails, is really more like an animal's claw. And here you've got a bowl of incense smoking away, which probably hints that the guy might be just a bit pongy. Now, the image is explained to us really in these almost speech bubbles, his and hers, down the side of the picture. Now, his speech bubble just includes gibberish, and that reminds me of how the ancient Greeks looked at the people they called barbarians, because what barbarian originally meant was someone who went ba 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 ba, and you couldn't understand a word they said, which is exactly what the woman is saying over here. I don't know what you're going on about, but get on with it. What's absolutely clear here is that this isn't playing to a Western audience. It's playing to a local Japanese audience. And the joke, very definitely, is on us. The word town hall doesn't usually conjure up wonder and awe in most of us, but it should. By the early 19th century, Britain's engagement with the outside world helped to transform our city centres, and some of our civic buildings were becoming just as impressive as any aristocratic country house. In order to bring civilization to their growing cities, a new class of wealthy industrialists invested in architecture in the grandest style, like this. Home to law courts, a concert hall, all built from the best British stone. It was part of a great cultural competition that saw rival towns attempt to outdo each other in their lavish displays of civic pride. They too looked to the classical world, this time with their cultural confidence, self-governance and mercantile wealth, to declare themselves as the new Athens, the new Florence, the heirs of the independent city-states of the past. The industrial world that once surrounded them has long gone, but they still stand as monuments to the civic spirit of those citizens that built them. And it didn't stop at public buildings or at Greece and Rome. Believe it or not, this incredible building in downtown Leeds was once a flax spinning factory built by the Yorkshire mill owner John Marshall as a replica of the temple of the falcon god Horus in the ancient Egyptian town of Edfu. A marriage of ancient Egyptian culture and British technology, its 2-acre roof was covered not only with pyramidal skylights, but also once upon a time with grass, grazed monthly by flocks of sheep that kept the factory floor below at the perfect temperature and humidity to spin the flax. In 1840, this was the largest single room in the world, housing over 2,000 workers. Its debt to Egypt was no coincidence. Flax was an ancient Egyptian product that was now to be spun into linen here in a new temple to British industry. That symbolic link between Britain and Egypt sometimes came out in even more surprising ways. One of the most beloved exhibits at the Ulster Museum in Belfast is an ancient Egyptian mummy. Another classic piece of British collecting. It was one of many brought back by enterprising merchants after the end of the Napoleonic Wars. There's something very moving and almost unnerving being up quite so close to the body of this young woman in her mid-20s, who's very, very far away from her home. She was acquired in the city of Luxor in Egypt, in a so-called mummy market, by a wealthy local Ulsterman whose family had made their cash in the British milling industry and in the slave plantations of the Americas. He shipped her back home and gave her to the local museum, and in 1835 there was a ceremonial unwrapping of the mummy. A slightly prurient occasion, it seems to me. There's 135 men, and only men, had come to watch. Now, there were experts on hand. There was the hieroglyphs man who explained by looking at the writing on the case that her name was Kabuti, or Takabuti, and that she had been the daughter of a priest of Amun. And then there were the state-of-the-art 19th century scientists who looked very, very carefully at the shape and form of the skull and tried to deduce from that what her character must have been. Seems completely mad to us, but they thought that she was an affectionate young person, slightly risk-averse, not terribly tasteful, and for some reason would have made a good naturalist. But there were people in the audience who were interested in something quite different. What struck them was the staggering quality of the linen in which the body had been wrapped thousands of years ago. Now, at this point, Belfast was well on the way to becoming the linen capital of the British Empire, Linenopolis. And many people watching had a big stake in that industry. What Takabuti gave them and Belfast was a direct connection between their modern city and the civilization of ancient Egypt. However tenuous they might have been, these cultural connections were a sign of the confidence with which 19th century Britain was writing itself into the story of civilization. But they also betrayed a deep insecurity about how civilized Britain's cities really were. Nowhere was this more apparent than in Manchester and its surrounding towns, which by now had become the powerhouse of the Industrial Revolution and the centre of the global cotton trade, Cottonopolis. Home to around 500,000 people, Manchester had been industrialised so quickly that it was described not just as a miracle of modern civilization from which pure gold flowed, but also with its belching factories and overcrowded slums as hell on earth, where civilized man was turned back almost into a savage. And so, partly as a riposte to the city's reputation as a place of profit and exploitation, Manchester decided to stage what remains to this day the largest art exhibition ever seen in Britain, the Manchester Art Treasures of 1857. But to pull it off, they first had to convince Britain's private collectors to lend their precious stashes of art, in many cases for the very first time. We might not be able to visit the buildings that this exhibition was in, but we've got tons of evidence for how these rich men put the whole show together. We've got the minutes of the meetings that they held. They transcribe the letters that they'd received, offering stuff or refusing, and then they transcribe it all again into ledgers, object by object and person by person. Sometimes they make quite funny reading. Here you've got the entry for Lord Lansdowne. He has no less than 3 addresses. He says he wishes the exhibition success, will contribute pictures, but, and you can almost hear him saying this, not without great reluctance, his ancient marbles. Here's the Earl of Carlisle from Castle Howard in Yorkshire. He's definitely coming up trumps because he promises to lend the pictures named in the list they sent him. And those are fine portraits of Snyder by Van Dyck, Velasquez, Jackson, and Mignard by himself. And it looks as if he's kind of added a bonus ball. His Excellency will lend a Zoffany if desired. But it's at the back that you find the kind of list of shame of those who decided they weren't going to lend even though they were asked. There's the Duke of Wellington. He declines on the ground that it may be used as a precedent to borrow on all hands and so keep his house empty. Poor love. In the end, the call-out was such a success that the exhibition boasted a staggering 16,000, mostly foreign works of art in British hands, from ceramics and sculpture to prints and paintings. Of the 1,173 old masters on display, there were 93 Spanish works, including Diego Velasquez's only surviving nude. And almost 200 works of the Italian Renaissance. One of the biggest hits of the show was this rare, unfinished painting by Michelangelo, which had only just been attributed to him, and which ever since has been known as the Manchester Madonna. And the Earl of Carlisle's painting by Carracci also drew the crowds, partly, some said, because of its heart-rending displays of grief, partly, according to others, because Louis Napoleon of France had offered 20 grand to get his hands on it. But the exhibition also bore witness to the emergence of a new kind of cultural confidence. For alongside the old masters were 689 mostly British new masters, so called in order to put British art firmly into the great traditions of the past. And some of these were as stunning as the old. This was one of the big highlights of the show. It's John Everett Millet's Autumn Leaves, and it's a decidedly eerie exercise in nostalgia. There are 4 moody girls stoking a bonfire which hasn't quite caught light yet, and one of them's got an apple in her hand. There are more than enough hints here that we're to think about death and decay, innocence lost, and the passing of time. I have to confess that when I was a moody teenager, this was one of my favourite paintings. And I rather vainly imagined I looked a bit like the central figure. But in the show at Manchester, you came upon this in the modern British painting section. You'd walked through earlier European art and you experienced that linear development which takes you to Britain's production now. And something of that chronological development was in the mind of the painters too, because Millet was a leading member of the so-called pre-Raphaelite brotherhood of artists who claimed to be seeking their artistic inspiration back beyond Raphael, beyond Michelangelo and Leonardo, at the very earliest wellsprings of the Italian Renaissance. It's as if they were asserting that they were rekindling here in Britain the very origins of European art. Ennobling as all this was, I can't help getting a distinct sniff of 19th century paternalism lurking behind the show. Special trains were laid on by mill owners like Bradford's Titus Salt to ferry the workers from their satanic mills directly to the exhibition. Slightly patronising guidebooks were even printed in local dialect, perhaps to poke fun at the lower orders, perhaps to direct them to the works they might enjoy. Truth is, they weren't all at the level of Michelangelo. Heaven only knows what workers or farmers or anybody really would have made of this piece of highbrow soft porn. It's supposed to illustrate a scene from Homer's Odyssey. The hero Odysseus is being restrained on his ship to prevent him falling into the clutches of those temptresses on the beach. The problem was, if you didn't know your Homer, there were no labels in this exhibition to explain what anything actually was. And the official catalogue, though there were cheaper unofficial ones, cost a whole shilling, which was a big chunk of the average weekly wage. And that detail alone points to some rather different undercurrents in the show. To be sure, there were some well-intentioned philanthropists involved who were keen to democratise art and to share its treasures with the workers. But philanthropy always has a flip side. I think it's worth pausing a moment and wondering what it must have felt like to be one of Titus Salt's workers who, after a long week at the mill, were corralled into a stuffy train, bundled off to Manchester, and made to enjoy the kind of art that their master thought they should. 5 months and over 1 million visitors later, the exhibition disappeared as quickly as it was staged. So, to capitalise on its success, in the late 1860s, Manchester's city fathers commissioned their own civic monument as a lasting legacy. This time, they rejected the classical for something that felt more British, although it too was foreign. Seeing themselves as the inheritors of the medieval textile centres of Europe, they modelled their civic palace on the Gothic guildhalls of Flanders and Germany. To decorate its gobsmacking central hall, and gobsmacking is exactly what it is, they commissioned a series of murals from the British painter Ford Madox Brown to celebrate the history of their proudly mercantile industrial civilization. The first scene you come to is the foundation of Manchester by the Romans. And it's true that the Romans did build a fort here, but this has been worked up into a very symbolic scene. Here's the Roman governor, and he's got a plan that he's consulting. We've got a few Roman soldiers here doing some craft bricklaying, but the guys who are doing the real heavy lifting are obviously the Brits. This one with his splendid tattoos here. It's as if, right at the very, very beginning of the history of Manchester, we have the labouring poor, labouring. But we quickly move on, that's 80 AD, we quickly move on several centuries to, this is a key moment in the history of British Christianity, the baptism of King Edwin. This actually happened in York, but it's been conscripted to the story of Manchester. Then we're getting rid of the Danes. This poor old porker's got caught up in the feet of a dead or dying Dane. And at this point, we're into the 14th century, and the title says, The Establishment of Flemish Weavers in Manchester. And this is really the start of the weaving and the cotton industry in this tale. And there's a royal visit coming from the Queen, who very much backed the idea of introducing skills from the Low Countries. Painted on both sides of the hall, the murals divided Manchester's story into two halves. If on one side were the bits of the foreign that the city fathers wanted to conscript into their story, then on the other were the fruits of British civilization that these imports had helped create, with later Mancunians now picking up the baton. There was science, the cloth merchant William Crabtree discovering the transit of Venus above his shop. Education, the draper Humphrey Chetham's library and school. And technology, John Kay's invention of the flying shuttle that revolutionised the weaving industry. And here in 1761, we're at the opening of one of Manchester's greatest commercial assets, the Bridgewater Canal, which brought coal from the Duke of Bridgewater's estates, his mines on his estates, into the centre of the city. And up here at the back, there's the Duke of Bridgewater enjoying a quick drink at the opening ceremony. But as often with these paintings, these upper-class heroes are there in the picture, but they're slightly backgrounded, they're sidelined. It's as if we're really meant to see the working people of Manchester centre stage. Taken as a whole, the Manchester murals brought the native and foreign, the rich and the poor together to create a modern and progressive vision of a city that traded with the world. In 1877, around the time these paintings were being commissioned, John Ruskin, one of Britain's most influential art gurus, remarked that Manchester could produce no good art and no good culture. In a way, this building and its decoration are a riposte to that. What the local worthies wanted to see in their town hall was a history, an identity, and a foundation myth for Manchester. Now, the paintings may seem just a bit cosy to us, with their little comic details, their apparently easy interaction between rich and poor, and their occasionally rather loose grip on history. But there are big claims being made here. Whatever Ruskin may have thought, this was a vision of a civilized Manchester, and a civilization based not just on Christianity or sense of community or philanthropy, but on trade, on profit, on scientific progress, on immigration, internationalism, and ingenuity. They were giving us a new vision of culture. If the message of the Manchester murals was that trade and the profits of trade could lead to art and culture, then the poster boy for this story was one of Ford Madox Brown's principal characters, Manchester's very own Duke of Bridgewater. Having made his fortune from the Bridgewater Canal, he put his money into what would become Britain's most famous collection of art. The collection has since been split up, but its most valuable pieces are now in the Scottish National Gallery in Edinburgh. It included some of the most beautiful paintings of the Italian Renaissance. And as luscious as they all are, it's this one by Titian that has the best story to tell. This painting now looks completely at home here, but actually, this is only its most recent stop on a much more tortuous journey. It's one of a series of canvases depicting classical myth, painted by Titian in the 16th century for the man who was then effectively the ruler of the Western world, Philip II of Spain. They're all of them dripping with luxury, with female flesh dressed up in classical learning, and with the power of monarchy. And as some of the most sought-after paintings anywhere, they were soon on the move. Some of the series went into the hands of other European monarchs, from Queen Christina of Sweden to the Archduke of Austria. This one was almost bagged by Charles I, but then it was given by Philip V of Spain to the French ambassador, who gave it to the Royal Collection of France. In the late 18th century, considerably helped by the French Revolution, Bridgewater managed to acquire it as part of a job lot of hundreds of other old masters. The traditional aristocracy of Europe was snobbishly outraged at the idea that some northern industrialist could hoover up their art treasures just because he got a lot of ready cash. Well, the complaint was not unlike what you now sometimes hear about our treasures ending up in Doha. But the basic rule is, and always has been, that masterpieces follow power and money. The men who rule the world get to own the Titians. By the end of the 19th century, you no longer had to go abroad to see the civilizations of the world. They were here. It was thanks to the success of exhibitions like the Manchester Art Treasures that museums and galleries were opened or enlarged right across the country. And with a substantial injection of cash to help them acquire art, Britain's collections began to change hands for the first time from the private to the public. Collecting and displaying the world's treasures had now become central to Britain's public sense of what it meant to be civilized. But this would soon lead to questions. Kicked off by one painting in particular, one of the stars of the Manchester exhibition, the Rokeby Venus. So called because it once graced the walls of Rokeby Park in County Durham, it was acquired for the nation in 1906 for the vast sum of £45,000, what would now be a multi-million-pound price tag. And it's been on display in the National Gallery ever since. First sight, the composition is very simple. There's Venus, the goddess of love, with her back to us here, and her little son, Cupid, with his wings, is holding up a mirror for his mum. But it isn't at all as simple as it might at first appear. One question is, who's Venus looking at? Is it the viewer, us, outside the painting? Or is she completely wrapped up in herself? It really is a who's looking at who kind of painting, and it's been one of the star attractions of the gallery since it arrived. People used to call it our Venus. But it's also become famous for another reason. In March 1914, Mary Richardson, a militant suffragette, smuggled a meat cleaver into the gallery, came up to this Venus and repeatedly slashed it. Over the next 4 months, a further 13 works of art were attacked by 9 different women. But it was the attack on our Venus by Slasher Mary, as she was called, that caused the most public outrage, and which, as she herself later explained, had the most pointed message. The question is, why did she do it? Modern viewers tend to assume that she was attacking the objectification of female flesh. But that is not what she said at the time, which was much more fundamentally political. She was attacking the celebrity status of this painting, the veneration that was lavished upon it, and the enormous cost that it had taken to acquire it when real-life women and children were being oppressed, exploited, and excluded. Richardson was raising a question that we must still face. What is the value of the painted body versus the living human body? Ultimately, she was challenging conventional assumptions about what civilized society was all about. It wasn't just the financial and moral value of art that was called into question, so too were the cultural assumptions that underpinned its display. The Pitt Rivers in Oxford is one of the most eccentric, eclectic, wonderful, but also slightly unsettling museums in the country. Founded in 1884 by the British Army officer General Pitt Rivers and added to ever since, the collection now includes objects from all over the world, from the ordinary to the extraordinary. First curated when, on the back of empire, Britain's confidence in its own civilization was at its highest, here objects were organised not by geography but by type, so as to demonstrate the development of artifacts from the simple to the complex, and of world cultures from the primitive to the civilized. Even children's toys are part of this vision of culture. And there's an amazing one here which is from Borneo, and it's actually a little monkey's skull which has been painted, the eyes have been filled in, and there's a cord on the top so you could swing it around. It was apparently taken from a child in Borneo who was using it to pretend to be a headhunter. And the old label says that headhunting was an occupation followed in grim earnest by adult warriors there. Now, I'm sure the label writer is trying to warn us about the dangers of headhunting. For us, it's hard not to feel sorry for the child who's had his toy taken away. It's very different, of course, today, but the founders of this museum used the emerging science of anthropology to put different cultures on a sliding scale of evolution. They created a narrative to put the civilized West at the top and those they would have called savages trapped in a state of arrested development below. This is just part of the collection of model boats, and there's a very splendid one in front of me. Written on it says that it was from New Guinea, and it was collected by Beatrice Blackwood, who was one of the curators here who travelled far and wide to collect this material. There's a story of her when she goes to the Solomon Islands, also looking for model boats, and she rejects one that's offered to her because she discovers that it had been made using European tools and European paint, and she wanted something that was in her head absolutely native, but the natives didn't have quite the same idea. One thing that story shows is how back then, some museums at least, were actively editing their collections to suit a very particular imperial worldview. But others would build theirs along very different lines. In the early 20th century, the World Museum in Liverpool was assembling Britain's most extensive collection of African art, much of it coming here thanks to one man, Arnold Ridyard. A chief engineer of the Elder Dempster shipping line, between 1895 and 1916, Ridyard made 77 voyages to the west coast of Africa, each time bringing back hundreds of artifacts for the museum. But what made his collections different was that many of the objects were given by African donors, whose names were meticulously inscribed in the museum's records. From tribal chiefs and traders to lawyers and local governors, these donors were creoles, Christian descendants of freed slaves who had been resettled in West Africa. And their donations reflected the realities of their world, influenced by both European and African civilization. Donors were the successful products of empire, and they wanted to leave their mark on the way people in Britain saw the cultures of Africa in their museums and galleries. They wanted to change the then dominant image of innocence or primitivism or even savagery, and they wanted to leave the mark of a modern Africa. In short, they wanted to change our narrative. And it wasn't just the narrative of the civilized and the savage that these donors wanted to challenge, but also the aesthetic value of African art. Up to then, objects like these were considered curios of colonized cultures, not art. And if the Manchester art treasures had made a gesture to India and the Middle East with an oriental court, nothing at all from Africa had been included. One of Ridyard's major donors was the London-trained barrister from Freetown in Sierra Leone, Claudius Dionysius Hotterbar During.
Why did he donate? It was the height of the empire. It was the colonial one. Maybe he wanted to show the world that Africa could produce something aesthetic and of value. when perhaps it wasn't deemed possible at the time that there was anything of great artistic value coming out from Africa. That's what I suspect may have been the reason, because he donated. He chose, I think, the pieces very carefully. They're beautifully carved in wood. And he thought it was a worthwhile thing to do as a young student, maybe to give something to the country he was studying in. I think certainly culturally, he thought it was a good way of sharing the art of Africa with England.
As a Christian Creole, Hotepar During may also have been trying to show that the art of non-Christian African cultures had as much sophistication and aesthetic power as any other piece of art in our national collections.
That's a good way of bringing it home, that Africa's not so different, yet it's different in a good way, in a positive way. You have strong cultures and strong traditions, which perhaps have been misunderstood. Perhaps by bringing it to England, people will be able to understand them better. It's a world culture as well. There's only one world, and perhaps the museums are a melting pot of that culture.
For me, that story sums up the many complex ways in which Britain has become a repository of the art and artifacts of the world. The products of empire, once here, have become ambassadors for their cultures. They've opened British eyes to other civilizations and created new ways of seeing that continue to amaze and educate the millions of us who will never have the chance to travel the globe. They also force us to ask more difficult questions about how they got here, about the cultural assumptions, even exploitation, that lay beneath their appropriation into our world. Ultimately, about what British civilization is. The answers will, I'm sure, continue to change, but the questions do point to one universal truth about civilization, best summed up in the story of what was once one of our most famous national monuments. First built by the Romans, by the late 19th century, London Bridge had become the gateway to what many people here assumed to be the centre of the civilized world. Yet, in 1967, it was put up for auction, bought by an American oil tycoon for $2.5 million, and shipped granite piece by granite piece to Arizona, where it was rebuilt by the developer of Disneyland to bring a bit of civilization to the American desert. Inaugurated in 1971, at an event attended by the Lord Mayor of London himself, it offers a final twist to the story of our civilization. We had now become the other. And just as we'd done to other great civilizations, Britain had now been commodified, shipped off, and repackaged on the other side of the world.
London Bridge was taken down, piece by piece, shipped away. London Bridge has now gone up in the U.S.
I guess what this tells us is that civilization's always on the move. It's always going somewhere else.
It's not just like anywhere. Everyone will pass by.
Exploring one of history's most important stories of migration on Monday night with the London refugees at 7:30 on BBC One. Here on BBC Two, our Civilizations season continues with a unique performance from hip-hop artist Akala next.